All right, so I will confess that I had originally not realized this was going to be more of a BOF-style session. So I do have a set of slides that we could go through, or we can just sort of keep it very conversational. It's kind of up to you guys. I was kind of meaning to cover just a few sort of best practices and then maybe talk about some different ways that you can manipulate search results. But maybe since it's a smaller group, why don't we maybe just go around and everybody introduce yourselves and talk about what's your experience with site search and Drupal to date. So I can start. My name is Martin Anderson-Clutz. I work at Northern, which is formerly Digital Echidna, and we tend to use Search API and Solr for most of our site search solutions. So that's kind of what I'm most familiar with, but definitely interested to hear what other people's experiences are. So why don't each of us, when we're done, try and hand off to the next person. So Ralph, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, I'm Ralph. I don't have much experience with search yet. I just wanted to listen along and get some ideas. And I'll hand it over to Noel.
That's perfect because I'm exactly in the same boat. I don't have a lot of experience, at least not with any. Well, I actually have only Drupal 7 experience as far as search is concerned, but we are working on Drupal 8 sites and we'll be migrating some 7 sites to 8 in the very near future. And I am just interested in hearing what everybody else is doing with the search. And I really feel like I need to know a little more about it and what the options are. And I'll hand it over to Jack.
Thank you. I'm Jack Franks. I'm primarily a back-end Drupal developer, doing a whole bunch of stuff in almost entirely in 8 now, so that's good. I love playing with Search API and doing interesting things with complex indexes and full text search and things like that. I have most of my experience is in Solr there, but the big project I'm working on is all AWS hosted. So we're about to be putting that in Elastic, which I don't have a lot of experience in. But yeah, I just like playing with search. It's fun to do interesting things with it. I'll pass off to Mauricio.
Hello, everyone. This is Mauricio Dinarte. I go by Dinarcon on Drupal.org and on any other places online. I have had some experience, particularly with Solr, both in Drupal 7 and in Drupal 8. I wish I could say there were good experiences. For the most part, they were like, people expecting like Google-like results from Solr, and especially around synonyms in my case, like synonym substitution and bringing basically yielding the same results for different terms. And even though I have been able to configure synonyms and the stuff, the results are not exactly the same. And that's been an interesting ongoing conversation with the client as to accept that or keep fighting. So yeah. I also came to hear experiences from others and try to adapt some of those into my own projects. I pass it on to Terry.
Sorry, didn't have the microphone on. Terry Schilling, I have a small hosting company and I do some Drupal websites, and I'm interested in implementing Solr search because the default search functionality on the Drupal 7 and Drupal 6 sites really didn't cut it. Also interested in seeing what people do to help, because for instance, the search on D.O really doesn't help a lot sometimes. And I'm interested to see if Solr can correct some of those problems, especially with a smaller site.
Jared, do you want to pick who's next?
Yeah, the only problem is I wasn't here at the beginning, so I don't know who's already done it. So
That's fair enough. Why don't we say, Aaron, do you want to go next?
Sure. Aaron Grant, I work for Sandbox Studio, a small firm in Chicago. We've done plenty of sites with Solar Search and use Search API to sort of make that connection. And we're always looking for ways to make it more useful for the users. It's always a challenge, especially as we get into more granular content as fed by paragraphs and sort of entity-driven components of a larger page.
Cool. Daniel?
Sure, yeah. I'm Dan Ficker, and currently I work for Pantheon as a customer support engineer, basically. So if you use Pantheon and have questions, you might get me in a chat or a ticket, as long with many of my teammates. But I don't know, I haven't done too much with search recently. I have a few sites that I play around with stuff on, but not too many sites I like actively maintain. More helping customers with their sites. But I have used search in the past, and I was just kind of, interested in mostly listening and maybe contributing a little bit about what my experience has been. So,
sounds great. And Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian Smith. I work for Reaching Across Illinois Library System. Yeah, I'm mainly interested in, sort of what Aaron had said earlier, really interested in search for dealing with granular content.
Cool. So I mentioned, I think before a few of you had come in, that I had started one of those scratch pads, sort of like shared note taking spaces. Can everybody see that in the chat, or does it only show like stuff that happens after you've got in?
I don't see it in my chat. So yeah, I think it's only after you get in. But
okay, so let me post that again. Feel free to add notes in terms of, stuff that you heard that you think is stuff you want to remember, or, if you think of things, whatever. Let's, it's a shared document, so let's go ahead there. Why don't because it sounds like we've got a few people in the audience who are in the group that maybe would be interested in hearing best practice. Why don't we start there? And then as we go through, if people have like, hey, I like to do it different this way because of that, or, those kinds of things, let's definitely keep it conversational as we go through it. So.
Totally. I say go for it. If you've prepared stuff, show it off. If we want to interrupt, we'll interrupt.
Good stuff. That's what I like to hear. So I'll give a shout out to the Drupal Marketing Initiative for making the slide deck, which I thought was kind of nice. So if you're here, you probably I don't have to convince you that search is important, but from a UX standpoint, it's often used by people who don't have the domain knowledge to sort of like understand the main navigation of a site. And if they're kind of looking for something in particular, they may just be like, I'm not going to bother trying to understand the structure of the site. I'm going to hit search and try and find what I'm looking for. So a couple of places where search is something that users are going to particularly rely on. And I saw this tweet today and I thought it was kind of relevant. So I thought, no, I'll just drop that into the presentation because, yeah, it's like you can, work your butt off to make this like awesome functionality and, like great content for your website. But if people can't find it, then, it's kind of a wasted effort. So definitely make sure that, not only is there compelling content, but also that people are able to find it. So as I mentioned off the top, my experience is more with Search API and particularly Search API with Solar. So the content that I have ready is really more about that, but definitely if people have experience that they want to share or questions that they want to ask about the core search, then, I think we should try and make some time for that as well. So starting with fields, one thing to keep in mind is that there are different types of fields in Solar, and then which ones will get indexed for relevance versus which ones will be available for things like facets is partly around how you tell Search API to index those. So full text fields are the ones that are going to be indexed for relevance. And then other fields like particularly strings or integers are going to be available for facets. And actually within the fields interface on Search API, if you go down to the bottom, there's this like collapsible accordion. And if you open that up, it's got all of the different data types. So it'll give you a little bit of an explanation. It's like at least twice as long as this because it has all these like other ones with like exceptions and whatever. But I think this list is probably a good starting point in terms of understanding those basic ones. So, you know, it's here, it says here, full text fields are the ones that are available for search, which, you know, I think for our discussion today is really like they contribute to relevance, whereas the other ones are more for, you know, different kinds of filtering and so on. One thing that you're going to probably want to do is look at boosting important fields. So title is definitely one that usually like a match in the title is going to be a pretty good signifier that the content is relevant to somebody's search. So you're going to want to boost up the title, but there might be other ones. So for example, if you know that you've got an e-commerce site and people are going to come in and use like the product ID, like the SKU, then you may want to boost that one higher, because an exact match there is, you know, a pretty strong indicator that that's exactly what they're looking for. So in terms of within the fields interface, you've got this like drop down, and one just means it's kind of like the default. If you had certain ones that you feel like should be really weak, you could set it to a lower number, but a higher number is going to boost up you know, a match in that field in terms of how it contributes to the overall relevance score of a particular result. One thing that I've really liked using in more recent builds of Search API is this rendered HTML output as a field. It allows you to basically tell Search API, instead of me going in field by field and telling you, like, this is the field and make it full text and, you know, like a bunch of those other things, you can basically say, take the rendered node of my content and just index the whole thing. And so when you know, somebody brought up paragraphs earlier, this is a really great way to get really complex content types indexed without a lot of effort. So you basically say, yep, just index the whole thing. And then if you want, you can layer on like, you can boost certain like semantic tags. There are ways if you wanted to have, so one of the downsides of this is that you lose the ability to say like, in this one field, I want a match in there to boost higher, but you theoretically could also render the whole thing and then additionally render that field as well, and then just boost it that way. So again, it can be a bit of a shortcut. Theoretically, you could also do things like, so let's just go to the next slide. So it basically, for each of your content types, will give you the option to say which view mode do you want to use. So you could have like search index as one, and then change the configuration to have like basically everything, but then pull out one or two fields if you didn't want them indexed for the, you know, relevancy piece there. So again, to me, this is like a huge time saver in terms of getting everything set up. Referenced entities can be a bit unintuitive, because by default, things like, let's say, taxonomy terms or users, what will get indexed is actually the ID, as opposed to like with a taxonomy term, the actual label. And so it works well if you want to use that as a facet. But oftentimes people will be like, well, I had this page, you know, tagged as, you know, whatever, you know, environmental issues. But when I search environmental issues, that doesn't come up as one of the results. And it's probably because what Solr has indexed is actually the ID value of that taxonomy term. So if you want it to show up for relevance, then you actually have to add that as a field. And then, so let's see here, I think I've got it in here, but just was taking a second. So when you're adding a field, you actually need to dig into that field, get the reference entity, and then get the name there and add it that way if you want that to sort of contribute to the actual relevance for the term name. And obviously this, you know, this is a taxonomy example, but the same could go for like usernames or, you know, a variety of other things where you may actually want it to index the name of the referenced entity, or even another field of the reference entity. As you can see, it'll list all of the different fields. But that's a good thing to know in terms of making sure that the right information from that entity is actually what you're getting indexed. So those are the different field pieces in terms of what fields you could index, and maybe some strategies for that. Anybody have any thoughts on like fields, or like, you know, things that are cool or horror stories or any of that before we move on to talking about processors?
I've got one. Going back to your comment about the rendered HTML output and paragraphs, I tried for the life of me to do it the sort of field-centric way where we're defining the specific fields that would be indexed. And I beat my head against the wall for several hours before I realized that using a display mode and the HTML output was way, way more streamlined for our particular purposes.
Nice. Okay, if there's no other comments, maybe we'll keep going with the processors. For anybody who's not familiar, the idea of a processor is basically it will manipulate either the indexing or the search query that's being passed through by the user, but oftentimes it'll do both so that it's kind of consistent in terms of comparing apples to apples. So it's actually a different tab in your Search API index configuration. And we'll get to screens a little bit in a second here. So, all right. So the first one is HTML filters. So a lot of times you're going to be indexing content that's going to have HTML tags in it. And so using this HTML filter essentially strips all of those out. It's going to make things like your search excerpts that appear look a bit nicer. If you're doing things like phrase matching, it's going to potentially make it work better in terms of like, if part of the match is, let's say, inside a bold tag, if you weren't using this filter, it may not match that properly. So particularly for body content or that rendered HTML output, I find that this works really well. And then the other thing as part of this configuration is that you can also say certain tags within there you should give a boost for relevance that matches, you know, for example, if there's like an H1 or an H2 tag in there, for the sake of relevance, that should probably be more significant than if it was just sort of like within the regular body text. So here's what that processor configuration looks like. You can just say like, enable that for every field. I find that there are probably only like 1 or 2 fields where you really need that. You have the option to say, like for images, whether it should index the alt attribute or title attributes. And then here's where you can do the boost by different tags. So I think these are basically default values I tend to use. And then, yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit later on. So ignore characters is basically saying, strip out certain characters like apostrophes or different kinds of punctuation that, again, might stop the indexed content that should be a match from potentially, you know, matching up to, again, like a phrase search or different kinds of queries that way. You can also use this for search in other languages. So, for example, if you're indexing French content, it'll have a lot of accented characters, but on a mobile device, it's kind of like really annoying to put those accented characters in. So oftentimes a native French speaker on a French site doing a search will use unaccented characters to do their search. And so it needs to be able to match the unaccented characters to the accented ones, and transliteration is a good way to do that. So ignore characters. This one I find pretty harmless, so I tend to apply that one pretty broadly. And usually stick with the defaults, but I feel like there have been a couple of times where I've had to customize that more based on, you know, a client having very particular needs in terms of what's going to be matched or not. So the next one is the highlight. And this one I really like to use because it's a good way to give that sort of Google style of result where you've got the title and then the excerpt below, and then it's actually going to like bold where the search terms are matched within the content of the result. The one caveat here is that when you're using stemming, which depending on your version of Solr may be kind of on by default, the output of this can be a little bit weird. And so what I tend to do is make an aggregated field, which is an option you can do in Search API, and say, basically give it a copy of what's in the rendered HTML output, except set it as full text unstemmed. And then that way you're getting kind of more the natural output of what that looks like without the HTML. But stemming, what it does is it'll take words. Usually, I think it works best in English, but it may work in other languages. I can't recall. And it might take words like swimming, swimmer, or swims and reduce that down to the base word swim. And then that way it can match all of those things. So if somebody says, swim location, it can match things in the content that would be swim location, swims at this location, those kinds of things. So it's a way of getting matches that aren't sort of like, an exact match by letter, but in terms of the base word are like referring to the same concepts, right? So here's what the highlight options look like. You can say when to highlight. You can say the size of the excerpt that it should return. You can, if you wanted to use something other than strong tags for that, you could do that. Or maybe you want to throw a class in there. You definitely have some options. So I tend to go with basically the defaults on these, but you may want to sort of play around with this and get figure out what works best for your particular site. And another thing you can play around with is parse modes. And the part that's a little bit confusing to me is that this is actually something you configure as part of your results view. It's not part of the search index. I guess it makes sense in a way, but it just seems weird that it's impacts the relevance, but it's actually part of the view configuration. So the default that it uses, I think, is Dismax parser, which is pretty fault tolerant. So if people put in kind of, like weird modifiers, it's basically just going to ignore all of those. You can change it to direct query, which allows a user to do like, plus this word to sort of like force to only show results that match this word, or have a minus to say, don't show me results that have this other word. I think you can do double quotes and some of those other things, but it is easy to break in terms of if there's something off in the query that the user provides, it'll just like return no results, even though something pretty close, like, if they change one modifier or something, they would see a bunch of results. So depending on the sophistication of your users, using something like direct query could be beneficial, but you might want to like make that available as like an advanced search or something like that. There can also be, there's an option to use fuzziness as part of the matching algorithm. So you can say, let's say up to 3 letters could be off per word. So if you have a lot of issues with typos or some of those other things, this can be a way to make sure that you get results, but obviously you'll get some false positives in there as well. And then sloppiness is a term for if you're doing, let's say, a phrase match, to say there could be a certain number of words in between the words of the phrase that you're trying to match. And then the last thing that I'll mention here, and we'll see it in a second, is that as you change the parse mode in that view configuration, it's actually going to give you a description of what that's going to look like. So here are the options that it comes up with in Search API for your full text search filter. You can see them there. And then as you change to any one of them, it'll put a description down here to give a bit of a description. So if you're having some issues, it feels like you're not getting good results, or maybe they're like too stringent or not stringent enough, maybe you can play around with different parse modes and see if those work better to align with your expectations of what you're hoping to get out of your search results. Any questions or comments about the processors? Sounds like we're good. All right, let's talk about different strategies for actually kind of like manually curating results, because I would say notionally you want to do as much as possible to get the overall kind of like algorithm or configuration as tight as possible in terms of like tuning the right fields and some of those other kinds of things. But inevitably, I feel like you're going to end up with a site owner who says, when I search for, this query, I want this other one to be on top, and it never is. It's like third or something. So how do I make sure that that one gets on top? So wanted to talk about some different strategies for kind of manipulating those results. So one of them is, this one is built into Search API, and it's, again, one of the processors, but it's type-specific boosting. So the idea is that you could say, you know, again, if you've got an e-commerce site, I want matches that are within products to be, you know, above any other kind of content, because I really want to make sure that people are directed towards products. And so you have a set of options for each bundle or content type that's being indexed, and you can affect the relevance. So again, this is a processor, and then you can see for each of your bundles, you can, you know, use the default, or, you know, weight it less or up, depending on, you know, how you want to sort of influence that content or that type of content within your search results. All right. There are also ways to boost recent content. So if your site, let's say, has a lot of like news content, you may say, I want more recent results to be weighted higher than older content. And I put a couple of links in here. I can make these slides available. I'll have to think. Maybe I'll put a link into the Drutopia pad here, because I will confess I've never actually had to do this myself, so I don't have any kind of like a graphic to show you. But so far, the reference I've come across seems like it involves writing some custom code and changing the parse mode. So by all means, if you try this out, I would love to hear somebody's experience and what it was like to set that up. Another strategy that I've used a few times is to have like a search keywords field. And basically you're giving the editor the chance to say, these are the keywords that we think are highly relevant to this piece of content. That can help you to rank it higher against those search terms, but it also gives you the opportunity, if, let's say, for whatever reason, the organization has kind of like internal terminology and they're forced to use that, but people outside the organization, like the stakeholders, people coming to the site, are always looking for things in using terminology that the organization is, like, whatever, let's say for legal reasons, unable to use. The search keywords allows you to map those two together to some degree. So I wouldn't say that it's like a true fix for like the synonyms problem that was mentioned earlier, but it's a potential way to help mitigate that to some degree, so that, like, unfortunately, you're having to do it on like a node by node basis, as opposed to like a true synonym fix, which would say, like, wherever, you know, this word gets indexed, it should also show up as relevant for this other word. You can do that in a Solr configuration. There's like a synonyms.txt file, but so far I have yet to come across anything within Drupal that really has an elegant way of managing that and then passing that through to like the Solr server. I think I saw one module where you could like define things, and then it would like export text files that you would have to FTP up to your Solr server, but that's a bit janky, I think, in terms of like having a decent workflow. So the search keywords field, again, is a way where you can sort of like manually assign relevance to different terms. You can boost it to say, like, if there's a match there, because it's almost like a curated relevance, we should probably boost that higher than just sort of regular body match. Typically, you're going to want to hide that from the view mode. So, you know, as somebody looking at the article or whatever the piece of content is, typically you're not going to want to see like whatever search keywords were manually assigned. It's really something that you want to keep hidden, but get indexed within your search index.
So is this, Martin, is this the search keywords field going to show up in the edit mode for a node, for instance, or is this only in the search API?
So this would show within the edit for the node. And I guess the other thing to mention is that if you're using the highlight, the search excerpt, then it may show up in there as well, because again, it's part of the content that's been indexed. So keep that in mind. A couple of other caveats about this approach is it's a way to add relevance, but not take it away. So this can't be used as a way to say, I don't want this node to show up for, X search. And then the other thing is that there's no ability to really sort of like manually rank those. So you can say, I want these 3 pieces of content to show up for that keyword. And, depending on how you have the boost settings, they may show up as the top 3, but you don't really have the ability to say, I want, this one 1, this one 2, and this one 3. So a caveat there. Here's an example of what that looks like. I've also seen us implement this using more of just a text area where you can, like comma separate them or put them on separate lines, or, keep it fairly free form. I don't think it really matters too much. Apart from the fact that, as I said, if it's going to show up in your search excerpt, then you may want to think about what's the best formatting for that. I think there was one more. Oh yeah, search overrides is a module that actually is designed to allow editors to be able to kind of manually curate those results. So it gives you an interface. It can be used directly within kind of like your node edit form to do things like promote or demote that piece of content against specific searches. And then also for promoted content, it gives you the ability to sort of manually rank those. So actually, I think I've got a bit of a demo here we can do quickly. So if I go into here, oh, maybe this isn't the one that I was thinking of. Let me grab. Yeah, this is the one. Okay. So let's go to our homepage site. Let's do a search for test and look at our results. So we've got, this is typical of a development site that I work on. There's lots of test content, but let's say this was a production site and we wanted this COVID testing content to appear first. So let's go in here. Let's edit that content. And then you can see we've got the search overrides tab over here. And we could say for searches against test, we want that to be promoted. And for whatever reason, let's say it's showing up for searches against the word squid. Actually, let's remove that. I meant to say we should exclude that, so we can say squid, and it will show up there as excluded from that. So again, it gives you that ability to either promote or exclude. And if we go ahead and save our piece of content, live demos are always exciting. And then let's go test, search again. It's not. So we got an error. I suspect that's not why, or that's why it's not working. Let's try that one more time. Go back here. Here. Okay, showing those, which is good. Let's see here. Let's look at the reorder. Okay, so that's why. It's because there's already promoted content there, and so it's showing those ahead because those had been promoted earlier. So we could go ahead here and now manually rank those to say we want the COVID one first. We want this changed one second, let's say. Let's go ahead and save that. And save our node. And now if we go back and look at our search results, we've got our COVID testing first, our change one second, and then our test article third. So those are the 3 promoted ones in the order that we sort of manually specified. So again, probably not something you need on every site. It's probably the kind of thing that could be overused by some clients instead of like actually writing good content or using keywords in the proper, sort of semantic ways. But it can be a good sort of like, if the client positively absolutely has to have, these 5 nodes in this particular order for that search, because it's the one that everybody comes to their site and searches. It's sort of a nice one to have available. One thing that I'll mention though is that this particular, so this module relies on a feature in Solr that was released in 4.7. So I know at this point, it doesn't actually work on either Acquia or Pantheon. I keep hearing that Acquia is close to rolling out Solr 7 as an option, at which point you will be able to use this module. But I haven't heard anything recently about this being something you could use on Pantheon in terms of them using a newer version of Solr. But I forget who it was. Was it Jack?
Earlier? No, it was me. It was me, Dan.
Oh, Dan, yeah.
Yeah, that's something I know that some people within Pantheon are working on, but I don't know that we have a timeline exactly when it'll be, a working solution at this point. Yeah.
And again, if it's something you absolutely had to have for your site because it's sort of like critical functionality, theoretically, you could also use one of the hosted Solr services. I feel like depending on how much volume you need, they're probably not going to be too expensive. So that might be another option to go if you're using a platform that doesn't have a new enough version of Solr and you really need to have that functionality. But as I say, it probably should be more of a last resort anyway. All right, let's see. A couple of other concepts that I wanted to throw out there, and again, open for discussion on these. Encourage people to think of relevance as a process and not a destination. So it's not a like set up your site, check if you're getting good search results, and then you never have to think about search anymore. Like really on a periodic basis. So like ideally monthly, but maybe quarterly. Go into your analytics and see what site searches people are doing most often. Go onto your site and actually run those, and then have some kind of a subject matter expert look at those results and say like, yeah, those are probably, the best results that we have. Or maybe they're like, no, the thing that's down in 8th is probably what people are actually looking for when they run that search. So I think having that, subject matter expert is probably an important piece because they may have a better sense of like what content is on the site for the type of stakeholder. What are they looking for? The other thing I've seen some companies do is actually have like a little bit of a survey so that they can collect data on the search results, and then as they tweak them, they can do the sort of like satisfaction ratings for provided searches. Does that go up or down as we tweak different things? So definitely some different approaches in terms of how you can implement this idea. But again, to me, I think there's an important idea of thinking of search as something that you should be continuing to look at, evaluate and sort of tweak on an ongoing basis. And then I think this was the last thing that I was going to mention here is think about giving context-specific searches. So, again, you can do your overall site, but you may want to have like a product search for your e-commerce site. Or if it's a municipal site, you may want to provide a search that's specifically for meetings and agenda, and provide like different filtering options, and maybe the results on that should have like, for each of the meetings, it'll display like links to, the agenda document and the minutes document and the video recording and some of those other kinds of things. But by making those more specialized, you can really provide a lot of extra value to the user in terms of, making it easy to connect to, the richer aspects of what it is they may be looking to accomplish. So anyway, those were some of the ideas that I wanted to potentially share. But, if anybody has thoughts on any of those, maybe additional things that they do to make search work better, or even if people are like, this is the problem that I run into every time, and I haven't been able to figure it out. Definitely want to open up the floor to whatever people want to talk about.
Well, Martin, I had a question for you about the rendered HTML output function. Is that a full page render, or is that on a per node? Or, I'm thinking about blocks that would be on every page or most pages on a site. I mean, would that show up on, in that rendered HTML output? If it's the whole page, then like the keywords might show up on every node reference. I mean, I don't quite understand how that works.
So anybody who's tested this and has a different experience, feel free to chime in. But I believe that it's sort of like the what would be in your Twig template is like the node content. So it's almost like the output of that node Twig template. So it wouldn't really have like blocks per se, is my understanding, unless you were using like a layout builder type solution, in which case you might get like inline blocks, or if you had placed like other blocks into your layout.
Yeah, that's right. It's only the entity content that gets indexed like that. A good way to test what you might have that gets rendered and then would be indexed is if you create a view and the display mode on that is a rendered entity output. You'll see that when it renders all of the nodes that you have selected in whatever your view criteria is, that it doesn't render out that whole page. It just renders the actual entities, and that's what gets indexed. So whatever is in the page surrounding it, it doesn't care about. It's only indexing entity content.
Any other questions, comments?
Well, I guess the thing that begs the question, and Jack, maybe you know this, what would happen if you have a decoupled front end and you're not using, you're not using Twig templates?
The search index is based off of the render service output from Drupal. So if you're using a decoupled front end, the search API doesn't care. It's going to use whatever Drupal tells it the entity looks like when it's rendered.
Might also be worth mentioning, because I don't think I brought attention to it when we were looking at that slide, but you can also tell Search API what user role to use when it looks at that. So you could theoretically index content that isn't publicly available, or vice versa. So, all right, I think we're almost out of time here. We probably can go over until people start showing up for the next session. But again, leaving the floor open to whatever people want to talk about.
Hi. Yeah, I'm seeing that there's a Search API attachments contrib module that's looks like it's currently in beta. Do you have any experience with that? Because we have a lot of content that, despite my pleadings that, hey, this should be a web page, we have a lot. It's like, oh, no, we're sticking a PDF onto this into this node.
Yeah, so actually, I've overall found that the Search API attachments module works pretty well. With older versions of Solr, you may need to have Tika available. So that's another like Apache sort of utility that actually does the work of like extracting out all of that content. But I've found that with more recent versions of Solr, you can actually use Solr's built-in indexing. I think it basically has like a lot of that Tika type extraction capabilities sort of built into Solr. And so from a management standpoint, it's easy to just sort of say like, yeah, use what Solr has, and then it kind of works pretty well out of the box in my experience.
Yeah, the Search API attachments module has a list of libraries you can use in order to do that. Tika is one of them, and the built-in Solr deep dive is another one of them. For our, what we're indexing, I actually haven't noticed much of a difference in using one versus the other, except that, of course, you have to set up Tika, and the built-in Solr thing. All you do is enable the feature, and then it just works.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, could you gentlemen put links into Drutopia there for those, that module, and also anything you might have about Tika, because that I'm totally unfamiliar with.
Also, Martin, could you please share the slide deck? That's very useful, resources there.
Yeah, for sure. I'll make sure that I put a link into the Drutopia pad there as well that has a link for those notes. So
thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I know synonyms was brought up early on. Has anybody tried to solve that in terms of making synonyms work with sort of Drupal and like Search API or Solr?
My experience has been tweaking the synonyms.txt and where it is processed on index time or on query time, but so far I get some what the client expect, but not quite there. It's been a lot of tweaking.
What version of Solr have you been using?
I think it was 8.
Okay.
Yeah, well, that is a project that has been going for a while. So I think we started with 6 or maybe even before 6, but at the moment it's 8.
All right. Well, I think what I'm going to do is maybe stop this presentation. Definitely.
Thanks for putting it together and putting it on. So,
oh, yeah, I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So yeah, by all means, keep an eye on that Drutopia pad, and I'll get a link in there. But yeah, if you guys, any of you have any other thoughts you want to drop in there, please share. So thanks, everyone.
Great job, Martin. Thanks.